When we first listen to the story of Icarus, the image that rises most vividly in our minds is that of a young man, bright with the heat of the sun, plummeting into the sea as his waxen wings melt away. Yet the myth in its earliest forms is richer and more intricate than that single, tragic moment. To understand its depth, we must begin with a close reading of the ancient sources that first gave voice to Daedalus and his son. In the Homeric tradition, the tale is not presented as a full narrative but appears as a brief, almost offhand reference in the Odyssey, where the bard mentions the craft of Daedalus as a benchmark of human ingenuity. The line reads, "The great Daedalus who wrought the labyrinth-fashioned wings of wax and feather for his son." Odyssey 11. 555-557, translation by Lattimore. Homer's economy of detail leaves much to the imagination, but it already establishes two crucial motifs: the ingenuity of the craftsman and the peril of overreaching. The Roman poet Ovid, in his Metamorphoses, Book 8, lines 183-215, expands the story into a vivid, lyrical tableau. He writes, "Daedalus, the cleverest of mortals, bound feathers to wax, shaping them as if they were the very breath of the wind. He fastened them to his son's shoulders, warning him, 'Do not fly too high nor too low, lest the sun melt the wax or the sea dampen the feathers.'" Ovid then describes the ascent. "The boy's heart swelled like a newly risen sun, and he rose higher than the pine-crowned cliffs, his eyes fixed on the blazing orb." When the wax finally gives way, Ovid's language is both mournful and beautiful. "The wing fell, the wax dripped, and Icarus fell, his limbs a spray of foam upon the sea." Ovid's version, rich in metaphor, invites readers to feel the tension between human aspiration and the immutable forces of nature. Apollodorus, in his Bibliotheca 3.121, offers a more straightforward, almost legalistic account. He writes, "Daedalus, having been imprisoned by King Minos, fashioned for himself and his son 2 sets of wings. He warned his son to keep the middle course, for the sun would melt the wax and the sea would soak the feathers. Icarus, in his youthful exuberance, ignored the counsel, flew too near the sun, and fell into the sea of Hellespont." Apollodorus' version is valuable because it preserves the moral framing that later Greek philosophers would seize upon. A warning against hubris, a cautionary tale of ignoring prudent counsel. From these three sources we can extract a consistent narrative core. Daedalus, the master artisan, constructs a pair of wings from feathers and wax. He binds them to himself and his son. He gives a measured warning about the dangers of excess. Icarus, intoxicated by the thrill of flight, exceeds the middle path. The sun's heat melts the wax, the wings disintegrate. Icarus falls into the sea, yet each author emphasizes different aspects. Homer highlights Daedalus's ingenuity, Ovid the poetic tragedy, and Apollodorus the didactic warning. By juxtaposing these versions, we begin to see how the myth has been a flexible vessel, capable of carrying a range of meanings across centuries. To bring this ancient narrative into the visual realm, we can turn to 2 concrete artistic examples that have preserved and reinterpreted the story. First, the frescoes of the Villa of the Mysteries near Pompeii, dating to the 1st century BCE, depict a series of mythic scenes that scholars have long debated. In one panel, a figure with outstretched arms, wings of feather and wax shimmering in the painted light, hovers above a stylized sea. Though the fresco does not bear an inscription, the composition aligns closely with Ovid's description. The figure's eyes are turned upward, his posture is one of daring, and a faint, almost imperceptible line of gold suggests the sun's heat. The fresco's muted palette and the delicate brushwork convey a sense of melancholy, as if the painter were aware of the inevitable downfall that follows the ascent. The second example is the 16th century tapestry cycle in Brussels, known as the Tapestries of the Labyrinth. Commissioned by the Habsburg court, these tapestries weave together the myth of Daedalus, the labyrinth of Crete, and the flight of Icarus. In the central panel, Daedalus is shown in a workshop, carefully attaching wax to feathers, while a younger figure, clearly Icarus, stands nearby, his gaze fixed on a distant sun rendered in brilliant reds and golds. The surrounding border features a series of symbolic motifs: a compass, a lyre, and a pair of scales, alluding to the balance between knowledge, art, and moral judgment. The tapestry's sumptuous silk threads capture the tension between the luminous aspiration of flight and the dark, churning sea below, reminding viewers that the story was not merely a caution, but also a celebration of human creativity. These visual artifacts are not isolated curiosities. They are embedded in a broader historical conversation about the myth's meaning. In the 5th century BCE, Athenian playwrights took up the Icarus story for the stage, though the texts themselves have not survived. The ancient historian Thucydides mentions a performance at the Dionysia where the son of Daedalus, in a tragic chorus, sang of his yearning to soar beyond the limits set by his father. According to the fragmentary comedy of Aristophanes, the audience laughed at Icarus's hubris, yet also felt a pang of sympathy when the chorus lamented, "We are all bound by wax, yet we dream of fire." This theatrical adaptation illustrates how the myth was used to explore the tension between individual ambition and communal order, a theme that resonated deeply in a polis that prized both democratic participation and respect for law. Centuries later, during the Renaissance, the myth resurfaced with renewed vigor. In Botticelli's The Birth of Venus, painted around 1485, a small, almost hidden figure of Icarus can be seen in the background, his tiny wings barely discernible against the sea's foam. Scholars such as E.H. Gombrich have argued that Botticelli placed Icarus there as a subtle reminder of the fragile nature of beauty and the perils of overreaching. The presence of Icarus in a composition primarily about divine love and idealized form creates a dialogue between the mythic aspirations of humanity and the transcendent, untouched realm of the gods. This Renaissance revival demonstrates that the Icarus motif could be woven into broader narratives about art, love, and the human condition. Early Greek moral philosophers seized upon the Icarus myth as a teaching tool. In Plato's Republic, Book 2, 376e-377a, Socrates recounts the story to illustrate the dangers of unbridled desire. Consider the youth who, like Icarus, seeks to rise above the good, to touch the sun of wisdom without the temperance that holds the soul steady. The soul, when unrestrained, will melt like wax, and the individual will fall into the abyss of ignorance. Plato's use of the myth underscores his broader argument that the soul must be guided by reason, lest it be carried away by appetitive impulses. Aristotle, writing in his Nicomachean Ethics, Book II, Chapter 6, invokes the notion of the golden mean when he reflects on the story. Virtue lies in the balance between excess and deficiency. Icarus in his excessive daring surpasses the mean, while Daedalus in his caution exemplifies the appropriate measure. The tragedy arises not from the act of flight itself, but from the failure to maintain the middle path. Aristotle's analysis reframes the myth as an illustration of his ethical theory, turning a mythic episode into a concrete case study for moral philosophy. Yet not all ancient thinkers accepted the straightforward cautionary reading. The Stoic philosopher Musonius Rufus, in a fragment preserved by Diogenes Laertius v. 13, argues that the myth celebrates daring rather than condemning it. The story of Icarus is not a sermon against ambition, but a testament to the human spirit's yearning to rise above the mundane. The sun in its brilliance does not punish the boy, it merely reveals the limits of mortal craft. The true virtue lies in the courage to attempt the impossible, even if the outcome is uncertain. Musonius' Stoic perspective emphasizes the value of striving and the acceptance of fate, suggesting that the myth can be read as an affirmation of boldness, a quality the Stoics deemed essential for the sage who confronts the vicissitudes of life. A later Hellenistic poet, the epigrammatist Callimachus, offers a different counter-argument in his Aeschia, Fragment 12. He writes, "Icarus is not merely a caution. He is a tragic hero whose flaw is not hubris alone but a profound yearning for the divine. He ascends because his heart is torn between earth and sky, and his fall is the inevitable consummation of that inner conflict." Callimachus positions Icarus alongside the tragic figures of Greek drama, Oedipus, Antigone, whose fates are sealed not by moral transgression but by an inexorable inner drive. In this reading, the myth becomes a meditation on the human condition, the perpetual tension between aspiration and limitation, between the mortal coil and the divine spark within. To broaden our understanding, we can compare Icarus with two other myths that share similar motifs of overreaching and divine punishment, the tale of Prometheus and the saga of Phaethon. Prometheus, who stole fire from Olympus and gave it to humanity, suffers an eternal torment for his transgression. In Hesiod's Theogony, lines 507-511, the Titan is bound to a rock, his liver devoured daily by an eagle, only to regenerate each night. Both Prometheus and Icarus embody the desire to bring the divine down to human-level fire and flight, yet they differ in the nature of their punishment. Prometheus' suffering is ongoing, a perpetual reminder of the cost of rebellion, whereas Icarus' downfall is swift and final, a momentary flash of hubris that ends in water. Phaethon, the son of Helios, offers yet another parallel. In Ovid's Metamorphoses, Book 2, lines 237-260, Phaethon begs his father to let him drive the sun chariot for a day. The sun's horses, untamed, veer too close to earth, scorching the fields, before Zeus strikes him down with a thunderbolt. Both Phaethon and Icarus are young men who seek to master the celestial realm, and both are punished by the gods for their overreaching. The key difference lies in agency. Phaethon actively seeks the chariot, while Icarus is a passive recipient of his father's invention, yet both share the motif of youthful impetuosity leading to catastrophic loss. These comparative myths reinforce the idea that the Icarus story is part of a larger mythic pattern: the human yearning to transcend earthly bounds, the divine response that reasserts cosmic order, and the moral or existential lesson that follows. By placing Icarus alongside Prometheus and Phaethon, we see how the ancient imagination repeatedly grappled with the paradox of aspiration. The same fire that enlightens also burns, the same wing that lifts also falls. Returning to the visual dimension, the frescoes of the Villa of the Mysteries and the Brussels tapestry cycle each emphasize different facets of this paradox. The frescoes' muted tones suggest a contemplative mourning for lost potential, while the tapestry's vibrant reds and golds celebrate the daring act itself, even as the surrounding symbols of scales and compasses remind viewers of the need for balance. This duality mirrors the philosophical debate. Is the myth a warning against excess, as Plato and Aristotle assert, or a celebration of daring, as Musonius Rufus claims? The artistic representations do not resolve the tension. Rather, they embody it, offering viewers a space to contemplate both the tragedy and the triumph inherent in the human desire to soar. Historical anecdotes further illustrate how the myth has been reinterpreted across time. In the 5th century BCE Athenian theatrical adaptations, the chorus often used the figure of Icarus to comment on contemporary political events. For instance, during the Peloponnesian War, a playwright might have drawn a parallel between Icarus's ascent and the Athenian navy's aggressive expansion, warning that the sun of imperial ambition will melt the wings of our fleet. The audience, aware of the ongoing conflict, would have heard the myth as a direct commentary on their city's fortunes, showing how the story functioned as a flexible political allegory. During the Renaissance, Botticelli's subtle inclusion of Icarus in The Birth of Venus can be seen as an artistic commentary on the humanist ideals of the period. The Renaissance celebrated the rebirth of classical knowledge, the pursuit of beauty, and the confidence that humanity could reclaim its ancient glory. By placing Icarus, a figure doomed by his own overreach, on the periphery of a scene celebrating divine love, Botticelli may have been cautioning his patrons that the very same ambition that fuels artistic achievement also carries the risk of hubris. The painting thus becomes a dialogue between the lofty aspirations of the age and the ancient warning that even the most beautiful creations are vulnerable to the forces of nature. When we examine the early Greek moral interpretations, we see how Plato and Aristotle each used the myth to illustrate a different aspect of ethical life. Plato's focus on the soul's need for reason and self-discipline aligns with his broader vision of an ideal city ruled by philosopher kings. He would have seen Icarus's fall as a metaphor for the soul that, when untethered from rational guidance, is consumed by the sun of unbridled desire. Aristotle, by contrast, is less interested in the cosmic moral order and more concerned with the practical habit of finding the mean. For him, Icarus's error is not merely moral but psychological, a failure to calibrate his internal desire with external constraints, a misjudgment of the right amount of ambition. Musonius Rufus's Stoic reinterpretation turns the moral lens on its head. The Stoics believe that virtue lies in living according to nature, which includes the pursuit of excellence. In Musonius's view, Icarus's attempt to fly is an expression of the natural human drive toward the good, even if the outcome is tragic. The Stoic emphasis on accepting fate, amor fati, means that the fall, while sorrowful, is part of the natural order. The myth then becomes a lesson in resilience. The noble attempt is itself virtuous, regardless of success. The Hellenistic tragic reading offered by Callimachus introduces a more nuanced emotional texture. He perceives Icarus not as a simple moral exemplar, but as a figure whose inner yearning is almost sympathetic. The tragic hero's flaw in this sense is not a moral failing, but a deep, existential longing to bridge the gap between the human and the divine. This reading anticipates later romantic interpretations, where the figure of Icarus becomes a symbol of artistic passion and the inevitable suffering that accompanies profound creative endeavor. These divergent readings, cautionary, celebratory, tragic, do not exist in isolation. They intersect with the mythic themes found in the stories of Prometheus and Phaethon, creating a tapestry of ideas about human aspiration. Prometheus's fire, like Icarus's wings, is a technological gift that reshapes humanity, yet both are punished by the gods for altering the natural order. Phaethon's reckless drive of the sun chariot parallels Icarus's reckless ascent, both ending in catastrophic failure. Yet each myth also contains a subtext of admiration for the boldness of the protagonist, Prometheus's cunning, Phaethon's audacity, Icarus's daring. This ambivalence, admiration mingled with warning, has allowed the myth to endure, to be reread in countless cultural contexts. In the frescoes of the Villa of the Mysteries, the artist's choice to depict the moment of ascent rather than the fall suggests an emphasis on the aspirational aspect of the myth. The figure's gaze is lifted, his body elongated, as if caught in the very instant of transcendence. The sea below is rendered in dark, almost abstract strokes, hinting at danger but not yet claiming the figure. This visual focus on the ascent aligns with Musonius Rufus's celebration of daring. Conversely, the Brussels tapestry's central panel, where Icarus is shown mid-descent, surrounded by the scales of justice, underscores the moral balance highlighted by Plato and Aristotle. The juxtaposition of these two artistic traditions demonstrates how the same narrative can be framed to support opposing philosophical positions. The Athenian theatrical adaptations also reveal the myth's flexibility as a political metaphor. In a comedy by Cratinus, for example, Icarus is mocked as a foolish youth who ignored his father's counsel, mirroring the city's own critics who accused the democratic assembly of being led by impetuous demagogues. In a tragedy by Euripides, the chorus laments Icarus's loss as a symbol of the inevitable downfall of those who overreach, perhaps reflecting the playwright's own pessimism about the fragility of human fortunes during wartime. These performances illustrate how the myth could be wielded to critique both individual folly and collective hubris. Botticelli's subtle inclusion of Icarus in The Birth of Venus further complicates the narrative. The painting's central focus is the goddess emerging from the sea, embodying divine beauty and love. Yet the tiny figure of Icarus, barely discernible, hints at the presence of human ambition on the margins of divine perfection. The Renaissance artist steeped in classical learning likely recognized the myth's layered meanings. By placing Icarus in the background, Botticelli may have been suggesting that even in moments of sublime beauty, the human desire to rise above the ordinary persists, a desire that can both inspire and endanger. When we consider the philosophical arguments in depth, we find that the early Greek moral readings rely heavily on the concept of sophrosyne, moderation, or self-control. Plato's caution against excess is rooted in his belief that the soul must be harmonized, with reason governing the spirited and appetitive parts. Icarus, in this view, represents the psyche that has been overtaken by the epithymia, the desire for sensory pleasure, leading to a loss of equilibrium. Aristotle's golden mean, meanwhile, is less about a cosmic order and more about a practical guide for ethical living. He would argue that the appropriate measure of ambition is not zero ambition, the cowardly avoidance of any risk, nor unbridled ambition, the reckless flight of Icarus, but a balanced pursuit that acknowledges both the potential for achievement and the constraints of human nature. Musonius Rufus, writing centuries later, reframes the conversation within the Stoic doctrine that virtue is the only true good, and that external outcomes, success or failure, are indifferent. For Musonius, the act of attempting to fly, of daring to challenge the limits imposed by nature, is itself an expression of the rational part of the soul striving toward the good. The fall, then, is a natural consequence, not a moral condemnation. This Stoic reading resonates with the Renaissance humanists who admired the classical hero's willingness to confront the unknown, even at the risk of disaster. Callimachus's Hellenistic perspective adds a layer of emotional complexity. He sees Icarus as a tragic figure whose downfall is not solely the result of moral failing, but of an inner compulsion that cannot be suppressed. This aligns with the Hellenistic emphasis on pathos and the exploration of human emotions. The tragic hero's flaw in this sense is an existential yearning, a desire to bridge the gap between the mortal and the divine. This interpretation anticipates later existentialist readings, where the focus shifts from moral instruction to the authenticity of the individual's experience. The cross references to Prometheus and Phaethon deepen our appreciation of these philosophical strands. In the myth of Prometheus, the theft of fire can be read as an act of philosophically daring, a willingness to bring knowledge to humanity despite divine prohibition. The punishment, eternal torment, mirrors the consequences faced by Icarus, though on a different temporal scale. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle discusses the virtue of phronses, practical wisdom, and suggests that the wise person must know when to act and when to refrain. Prometheus's act could be seen as lacking phronses, just as Icarus's ascent lacks the measured judgment advocated by Aristotle. Phaethon's story, meanwhile, underscores the danger of unprepared ambition. Both myths, like Icarus, involve a youthful figure attempting to control forces beyond their capacity, reinforcing the ancient caution that the cosmos is not easily mastered. In modern scholarship, the Icarus myth continues to serve as a fertile ground for interdisciplinary analysis. Philosophers of technology, for example, invoke Icarus when debating the ethical limits of scientific advancement. The metaphor of wax wings melting under the sun has been applied to discussions about climate change, artificial intelligence, and genetic engineering, fields where human ingenuity pushes the boundaries of nature, sometimes without adequate foresight. The ancient moral readings of Plato and Aristotle find new life in these contemporary debates, reminding us that the balance between ambition and prudence remains a timeless concern. Meanwhile, artists and writers have reimagined Icarus in myriad ways. In modern poetry, the image of Icarus falling into the sea becomes a symbol of personal loss, of love unfulfilled. In cinema, the story is often reframed as a narrative of rebellion against oppressive systems, where the protagonist's flight represents a quest for freedom. These reinterpretations echo the Stoic celebration of daring, the Hellenistic emphasis on tragic yearning, and the ancient caution against excess, all coexisting within a single mythic framework. To bring this discussion full circle, let us return to the two visual exemplars we began with. In the frescoes of the Villa of the Mysteries, the painter's choice to freeze the moment of ascent invites the viewer to linger on the beauty of the attempt, to feel the exhilaration of rising above the earth. In the Brussels tapestry, the juxtaposition of the ascent with the scales of justice forces the viewer to consider the moral dimensions of the act. Both works embody the dual nature of the Icarus story, a celebration of human ingenuity and a reminder of the limits imposed by nature and morality. When we listen to the ancient voices, Homer's brief allusion, Ovid's lyrical tragedy, Apollodorus's didactic clarity, we hear a chorus of perspectives that have resonated through the ages. Plato and Aristotle hear a warning, Musonius Rufus hears a hymn to daring, Callimachus hears a tragic yearning. The myth's adaptability is its power. It can be a moral lesson, an artistic inspiration, a political allegory, a philosophical case study, or a symbol of existential longing. By examining the narrative details, the artistic representations, the historical adaptations, and the philosophical arguments, we come to appreciate the Icarus myth not as a simple cautionary tale, but as a complex, multi-layered story that continues to challenge and inspire us. In the end, perhaps the most profound lesson of the Icarus myth is not whether the wings should have melted, but why we are compelled to fashion wings at all. The story asks us to consider the nature of human aspiration. What drives us to seek the sun, to push beyond the safe middle path, to risk the very thing that sustains us? Whether we interpret Icarus as a warning, a celebration, or a tragic hero, the myth invites each generation to reflect on its own relationship with ambition, with the limits of knowledge, and with the delicate balance between daring and humility. And as we contemplate the wax, the feathers, the sun, and the sea, we find ourselves standing at the edge of a timeless question, one that, like the myth itself, will continue to rise and fall with each new generation that dares to look upward. The story of Icarus, that young man whose wax-laden wings melted under the unforgiving sun, has been told and retold for millennia, yet each retelling seems to uncover a fresh layer of meaning. In the quiet moments before we speak, we might ask ourselves, what does it mean to reach for the heavens, and what does it mean to be pulled back down? The ancient Greeks, ever attentive to the balance between aspiration and restraint, found in Icarus a vivid illustration of hubris, the dangerous overstepping of limits that the gods themselves had set. As we begin this exploration of classical philosophical readings on hubris, ambition, and the limits of human aspiration, let us first turn to the earliest sources that framed the myth not merely as a cautionary tale, but as a mirror for the soul's own ascent and potential fall. Plato, in his dialogue Phaedrus, speaks of the soul as a charioteer, guiding two horses, one noble, the other unruly. He writes, the soul, when it is freed from the body, will ascend to the realm of the forms if it has been trained by reason. The image is unmistakably reminiscent of Icarus, a being equipped with wings of intellect and imagination, poised to soar beyond the familiar sky of everyday experience. Yet Plato warns that the ascent must be measured. In the Symposium, through the voice of Diotima, he tells us that love itself is a ladder, each rung demanding a step of moderation before the next can be taken. The lover must not rush, she says, for the heights are reached only by those who pace themselves, who recognize the limits of the body and the mind. Here the myth of Icarus becomes a metaphor for the soul's journey. The sun is the blinding light of ultimate truth, the sea the abyss of ignorance, and the wings, our rational capacities, must be tempered by the discipline of philosophy. Aristotle, a student of Plato yet a relentless empiricist, would later articulate a concept that serves as a practical safeguard against the kind of reckless ambition that Icarus embodied. He called this phronsis, or practical wisdom, the ability to discern the appropriate means to achieve a good end. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle declares, "The good for man is an activity of the soul in conformity with excellence, and the excellence is not merely theoretical knowledge, but the capacity to apply it rightly in the particulars of life." Phronses is, in effect, the charioteer's reins, preventing the wings from being pulled too far toward the sun. It asks the aspirant to ask, what is the right time, the right measure, the right place for this flight? In the context of Icarus, Phronses would have urged the young man to test his wings at a modest altitude, to feel the wind, to gauge the heat, rather than to launch himself straight into the blaze of the midday sun. The Stoics, inheritors of the Platonic tradition of self-governance, took this caution even further. In his moral letters to Lucilius, Seneca recounts a story that mirrors the Icarian tragedy, not to condemn ambition per se, but to illustrate the perils of untempered desire. He writes, "Do not be like the man who, having built a ladder to the heavens, climbs it without regard for the strength of the rungs, and then falls, broken by his own haste." Seneca's counsel is clear. Ambition, when divorced from virtue, becomes a fragile construct. He adds, "The wise man knows that the sun is a source of light, not a fuel for the soul's fire." In this Stoic reading, the wax of Icarus's wings is not merely a material that melts, but a symbol of unchecked passion that erodes the moral fiber needed to sustain any lofty endeavor. Contrastingly, the Epicurean poet Lucrellus offers a different perspective in his De Rerum Natura. He does not condemn Icarus for daring to fly. Instead, he frames the myth within the broader discourse on the limits of human knowledge and the natural order. Lucretius observes, "The atoms that compose the wings are as bound to the sun's heat as the flesh of the man. To deny the pull of nature is to deny the very essence of being." Here, the fall is not a moral failing, but a natural consequence of the physical world's constraints. The Epicurean view suggests that ambition, when aligned with an understanding of nature's laws, can be a source of joy rather than a cause of hubris. It invites us to ask, can we, like Icarus, aspire to the heavens while accepting that the sun's heat will always temper our reach? These two ancient commentaries, Stoic restraint and Epicurean acceptance, provide a dialectical pair that continues to echo through the ages. The Stoic insists on the necessity of inner discipline. The Epicurean reminds us that the universe itself imposes boundaries, and wisdom lies in recognizing them. Both, however, share a common thread. They view the myth not simply as a story of a boy's folly, but as a philosophical laboratory where ideas about desire, reason, and the natural order are tested and refined. Let us now turn to history itself, where the myth of Icarus found a living embodiment in the trial of Socrates. In 399 BCE, the Athenian assembly condemned the philosopher to death for corrupting the youth and introducing new gods. Socrates, like Icarus, had risen on the wings of reason, challenging the conventional wisdom of his polis. He questioned the very foundations of Athenian morality, urging his interlocutors to examine the eudaimonia, the good life, through rigorous dialectic. When faced with the verdict, he could have fled into exile, could have sought the patronage of another city. Instead, he chose to stay, to drink the hemlock, accepting the law of the city even as he critiqued it. In Plato's Apology, Socrates declares, "The unexamined life is not worth living," a statement that resonates with the Icarian ambition to reach higher truths, even at the cost of personal safety. Yet his steadfastness also illustrates the danger of overreaching without the protective harness of Phronses. He flew too close to the sun of political dissent, and the Athenian democracy, still a fledgling experiment, could not accommodate his radical ascent. Another historical vignette, set in the aftermath of the Persian Wars, shows the Athenian city-state wrestling with the same tension between pride and prudence. After the decisive victories at Marathon, Salamis, and Plataea, Athens emerged as a naval powerhouse, its empire expanding across the Aegean. The famed Pericles, in his funeral oration, celebrated the city's daring spirit, declaring that the Greeks are a people who love the light, who are not afraid to venture beyond the horizon. Yet, the very same citizens who sang of triumph also feared the hubris that could bring divine retribution. The poet Aeschylus, in his tragedy Prometheus Bound, warns that the gods do not tolerate those who think themselves equal to them. The Athenian response, therefore, was a delicate dance. They built grand monuments, the Parthenon, a testament to human achievement, while instituting laws that limited the power of any single individual. Their ambition was lauded, but always under the watchful eye of the polis, a collective Phronses that sought to keep the Icarian flame from scorching the city's foundations. From these ancient episodes we can extract a pattern. Societies that cherish ambition must also cultivate a cultural framework that tempers it. The Greek concept of hubris, the overstepping of human limits, was not merely a personal failing, but a communal threat. In tragedies such as Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, hubris manifests when Oedipus declares, "I will find the truth, whatever the cost," only to discover that his relentless pursuit leads to catastrophe. The chorus, representing the voice of the community, warns, "Know your place, for the gods watch over the balance." The same motif recurs in the Icarian myth. The individual's yearning for transcendence is juxtaposed against the collective need for order. The Christian tradition later reinterpreted the fall of Icarus through the lens of original sin. Augustine, in his Confessions, likens the human desire for heavenly glory to the angels who fell from grace. We are like Icarus, seeking the light of God, yet our pride makes us fall. The allegory transforms Icarus into a symbol of humanity's inherent sinfulness, a reminder that the path to redemption requires humility, not just aspiration. This theological reading dovetails with the Greek cautionary stance, yet adds a salvific dimension. The fall is not merely punitive, but a prelude to a higher moral awakening. Modern philosophers have continued to wrestle with the Icarian dilemma. In contemporary virtue ethics, scholars such as Alastair MacIntyre argue that the development of virtues, courage, temperance, justice, requires a communal narrative that guides individual ambition. He writes, "A flourishing life is not the product of isolated brilliance, but of the integration of personal excellence within a shared tradition." In this view, the Icarus myth warns against the isolation of ambition from the moral scaffolding provided by community and tradition. But not all thinkers see the fall as a warning. Friedrich Nietzsche, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, celebrates the Dionysian spirit, a force that embraces chaos, risk, and the transvaluation of values. He declares, "What does the eagle say to the sparrow? Fly higher." Nietzsche would likely interpret Icarus's fall not as a tragedy, but as a necessary sacrifice for the emergence of the Übermensch, the higher man who must first break the chains of conventional morality. He writes, "The abyss that swallows the Icarus is the crucible in which the new self is forged." In this reading, the sun's heat is not a destructive force, but a purifying fire that burns away the old self, allowing the aspiring individual to become something greater. Nietzsche's perspective forces us to ask, is the fear of hubris itself a form of hubris, a denial of the human capacity to reinvent itself? Even the sophists, the itinerant teachers of rhetoric and relativism, offered a counterpoint to the moralizing tradition. Protagoras famously claimed, "Man is the measure of all things." From a sophist standpoint, the myth of Icarus is a neutral tool, a narrative that can be deployed either to caution against overreaching or to champion radical innovation. A sophist might argue, if the city wishes to build a new form of governance, it must be willing to fly higher than its ancestors dared. In this light, Icarus becomes a symbol of progress rather than a cautionary tale, and the sun is not a limit but a beacon. The sophist argument pushes us to consider whether myths themselves are morally loaded, or whether their moral weight is assigned by the societies that adopt them. To bring these philosophical threads together, let us consider two concrete examples from the modern world that echo the Icarian tension. The first is the field of aerospace engineering, where the ambition to reach beyond Earth's atmosphere is literal. The Space Shuttle Challenger disaster of 1986 serves as a stark reminder of the perils of overconfidence. Engineers, driven by the desire to achieve unprecedented feats, ignored warning signs about O-ring vulnerabilities. In their pursuit of glory, they neglected the practical wisdom, phronses, that would have called for caution. The tragedy mirrors Icarus's wax wings. The heat of the sun, here, the heat of public expectation and corporate pressure, melted the fragile seals and the shuttle fell. The subsequent Rogers Commission report emphasized the need for a culture of responsibility, echoing Seneca's admonition that ambition must be checked by ethical restraint. The second example lies in the realm of digital innovation. The rapid rise of social media platforms has been likened to a modern Icarus flight. Creators, empowered by algorithms, have built wings of connectivity that have lifted billions into a new realm of communication. Yet the same platforms have also faced backlash for amplifying misinformation, eroding privacy, and fostering echo chambers. The hubris of assuming that technology alone can solve humanity's problems without ethical oversight has led to societal fallout, regulatory crackdowns, public distrust, and calls for a digital grounding. Here, the sun is the unrelenting drive for profit and growth, and the melting wax is the erosion of public trust. The lesson aligns with both Stoic and Epicurean insights. Ambition must be tempered by virtue, and must respect the natural limits of human cognition and social cohesion. Analogies can help us internalize these lessons. Imagine a climber scaling a sheer cliff. The rope represents reason, the harness, phronses, the carabiners, the communal norms that keep the climber attached to the rock face. If the climber disregards the harness and relies solely on raw strength, they may reach higher than any before, but a slip, perhaps a gust of wind or a loose foothold, will send them plummeting. If the climber instead respects the tools, checks each anchor, and proceeds with measured steps, the ascent becomes sustainable, and the view from the summit is shared, not a solitary, fleeting triumph. Icarus, in this analogy, is the climber who ties his rope to a flimsy branch, confident that his skill alone will sustain him, only to find the branch brittle under the sun's heat. Historical anecdotes further illuminate the dynamic. The Athenian response to the Persian Wars, for instance, showcases a collective Icarian moment. After the victories, Athens embarked on an ambitious building program, commissioning the Parthenon, the long walls, and a navy that projected power across the Aegean. Yet the very same ambition sowed the seeds of the Peloponnesian War, as rival city-states feared Athenian hubris. Thucydides records the Athenians, confident in their superiority, believed they could dominate the seas forever, but this belief blinded them to the growing resentment of Sparta. The eventual defeat of Athens serves as a reminder that even a city-state, when it flies too close to the sun of imperial ambition, can experience a catastrophic fall. A second anecdote comes from the Renaissance, when the polymath Leonardo da Vinci sketched designs for a flying machine, a precursor to the modern airplane. Leonardo's notebooks are filled with observations of birds, calculations of lift, and sketches of an ornithopter. Yet, he never built a working prototype, perhaps recognizing the limits of the materials of his time. Leonardo himself wrote, "The greatest deception is the belief that we can achieve what the heavens forbid without due preparation." In this way, Leonardo's restraint mirrors the Stoic lesson. The desire to fly is noble, but the execution must respect the constraints of physics, just as Icarus's wax wings could not endure the sun's heat. Leonardo's prudence allowed his ideas to survive centuries, influencing future engineers who eventually succeeded, perhaps a more measured Icarus who learned from the myth. Cross-referencing these stories with the concept of hubris in Greek tragedy, we see a pattern. The tragic hero, whether Oedipus, Prometheus, or Icarus, confronts a divine order that cannot be outrun. Their downfall is not merely personal but serves as a communal warning. In Sophocles' Antigone, the titular heroine defies King Creon's edict to bury her brother, asserting a higher moral law. Creon's hubris, his belief that state law supersedes divine law, leads to his ruin. The chorus, echoing the Greek moral framework, reminds us that the man who oversteps his limits invites the wrath of the gods. The Icarian myth fits seamlessly into this tradition. It is a narrative that teaches the community about the perils of unchecked ambition, while also allowing for individual reflection on the balance between aspiration and humility. When we trace the myth into later Christian allegories of the fall, we encounter the story of Lucifer, the angel who, like Icarus, desired to ascend beyond his appointed station. Augustine writes, "The pride of the fallen angel is the same fire that burned Icarus's wings." The Christian narrative reframes the myth as a theological lesson. The desire for divine proximity, when motivated by pride, results in eternal separation. Yet Christian mystics such as St. John of the Cross reinterpret the ascent as a soul's journey toward union with God, provided it proceeds through the dark night of self-purification. In this mystical reading, the sun is not a destructive force, but a divine illumination that, if approached with humility, can transform rather than annihilate. The tension between these readings mirrors the ancient philosophical split between the Stoic caution and the Epicurean acceptance of natural limits. Nietzsche's Dionysian celebration, however, offers a radical departure. He argues that the Apollonian order, represented by the measured ascent of the soul, must be balanced by the Dionysian impulse toward ecstatic, boundless expression. In this synthesis, Icarus's fall is not a failure but a necessary rupture that allows the birth of a new mode of being. Nietzsche writes, "The higher man must learn to love his own destruction, for it is the furnace that forges his new self." This perspective invites us to reconsider the role of hubris. Perhaps hubris is not a vice to be eradicated but an engine of transformation, provided it is harnessed within a larger cultural framework that can absorb the shock of its consequences. The sophist argument pushes the conversation further into the realm of epistemology. If myths are neutral tools, then the story of Icarus can be employed to justify both caution and radical innovation. In the age of the Enlightenment, thinkers like Voltaire used the myth to mock religious dogma, suggesting that the sun's heat represents the light of reason that will melt the wax of superstition. In the industrial age, entrepreneurs invoked Icarus as a symbol of daring entrepreneurship, celebrating those who fly too close to the sun in pursuit of progress. The duality of the myth demonstrates its rhetorical power. It can be marshaled to defend either the status quo or the revolutionary. This versatility underscores the sophist claim that meaning is not inherent in the story, but is conferred by its users. Turning now to contemporary applications, we see the Icarian motif resonating in the ethical debates surrounding artificial intelligence. Researchers and technologists are building machines that can learn, reason, and perhaps one day surpass human cognition. The AI alignment problem asks whether we can ensure that superintelligent systems act in accordance with human values. In this context, the wax wings are the algorithms, the sun is the relentless drive for performance and profit, and the sea is the unknown consequences of uncontrolled AI. Many ethicists, echoing Seneca's caution, warn that without phronsies, the practical wisdom to anticipate long-term impacts, humanity may be building a set of wings that will melt under the heat of market pressure. Others, inspired by Nietzsche's celebration of the overman, argue that we must push AI beyond current limits, even if it entails risk, because the potential gains, new scientific insights, solutions to climate change, are worth the gamble. The debate itself is a modern reenactment of the ancient tension between aspiration and moderation. In the field of environmental policy, the Icarus myth offers a vivid illustration of humanity's relationship with the planet. The Industrial Revolution gave humanity the tools to fly, to harness fire, to dominate nature, to expand beyond the confines of immediate survival. Yet climate change reveals that the sun's heat, here, the warming of the planet, has begun to melt the very foundations of our civilization. The flight of modern industry, untempered by phronsies, threatens to collapse under its own heat. Here, the Stoic admonition to align ambition with virtue becomes a call for sustainable development, for policies that respect ecological limits while still allowing for human progress. To deepen our understanding, let us cross-reference the Icarus myth with the concept of megalopsychia, the greatness of soul, as articulated by Aristotle. Megalopsychia praises the noble soul that seeks great deeds, but it also demands a realistic assessment of one's capacities. Aristotle writes, "The great-souled man aims at what is worthy of his nature, not at what is beyond it." The Icarian tragedy, then, can be read as a failure of megalopsychia. Icarus aimed at the sun, a realm beyond human capacity, without the requisite self-knowledge. This brings us back to the Platonic allegory of the soul's ascent. The soul must recognize the proper ladder of virtues before attempting to grasp the highest form. The lesson is clear: ambition without self-knowledge is a recipe for disaster. In the modern philosophical landscape, the concept of bounded rationality, introduced by Herbert Simon, echoes the ancient warnings. Simon posits that human decision-making is limited by information, cognitive capacity, and time. He writes, "We are not omniscient architects, we are builders who must work within the constraints of the materials at hand." The Icarus story, when viewed through this lens, becomes a parable about the dangers of ignoring the bounds of our knowledge. The wax that melts is the limited understanding that cannot sustain an unqualified leap. The modern scholar, therefore, must cultivate phronsies, the ability to navigate within these bounds while still seeking improvement. The narrative of Icarus also resonates with contemporary discussions of personal fulfillment and mental health. In an age where social media amplifies the desire for rapid achievement, individuals may feel compelled to fly high, to acquire status, wealth, or fame, without attending to the inner work that sustains such ascent. Psychologists like Carl Rogers emphasize the importance of congruence between one's self-concept and lived experience. Rogers writes, "When the organism is free to grow, it will find its own direction, but if it is forced to adopt a direction that is not its own, it will suffer." The forced ascent, akin to Icarus's reckless climb, leads to burnout, anxiety, and a sense of falling. The therapeutic process, then, can be seen as a cultivation of phronsies, learning to set realistic goals, to recognize limits, and to find balance between aspiration and well-being. To bring these threads together, let us imagine a dialogue between the various thinkers we have encountered. Plato, with his charioteer soul, would ask Icarus to reflect on whether his desire to soar was guided by the rational horse or the unruly one. Aristotle would probe whether Icarus possessed phronsies to judge the appropriate altitude. Seneca would remind Icarus that the sun is not a friend to the careless, while Lucretius would counsel acceptance of nature's constraints. Nietzsche would challenge both, urging Icarus to embrace the fall as a crucible for becoming. The sophist would smile, noting that the story can be used to support any argument, depending on the speaker's purpose. And the modern ethicist would add that the stakes are higher now. Our wings are not made of wax, but of code, of policy, of collective will, so the consequences of a fall reverberate across societies. In closing, the philosophy of Icarus is not a static lesson locked in antiquity. It is a living conversation that stretches from the Platonic dialogues to the halls of contemporary research labs, from the marble of the Parthenon to the digital screens that fill our evenings. It invites us to ask repeatedly where the line lies between daring and hubris, between the noble ascent of the soul and the dangerous overreach that can lead to ruin. It urges us to cultivate phronses, that practical wisdom that can hold our wings steady, that can measure the heat of the sun against the strength of our material. It reminds us that ambition, when coupled with virtue, can lift humanity to new heights, but when untethered, can cause us to plummet. As we reflect on the myth, let us remember the words of the ancient poet Pindar, who wrote, "Rise, but rise with a mind that knows its limits." And let us, in our own flights, whether towards scientific discovery, artistic expression, or moral improvement, keep that mindful balance, lest we find ourselves, like Icarus, soaring too close to the sun. The story of Icarus began as a simple warning, a cautionary tale whispered to children about the danger of hubris, of wings that melt when the sun is stared at too long. Yet as the world moved from the medieval darkness into the bright corridors of the Renaissance, that same myth was reshaped, its feathers rearranged, its meaning stretched, until it became a banner for scientific daring and artistic freedom. How does a myth about a boy who fell from the sky become a symbol of humanity's relentless reach toward the heavens? To answer that, we must follow the thread of imagination that runs through the sketches of Leonardo da Vinci, the brushstrokes of Pieter Bruegel, the daring of Johannes Kepler, and the fervor of a revolutionary France that saw in Icarus both a caution and a rallying cry. Leonardo da Vinci, the quintessential Renaissance polymath, never ceased to be fascinated by flight. In the pages of his Codex Atlanticus, compiled around 1510, we find a series of delicate sketches, winged contraptions that echo the very feathers of Daedalus's invention. One drawing, labeled "Designed for a Flying Machine," shows a man perched on a frame of stretched fabric, his arms stretched wide, a cord looping around his waist. Beside the illustration, Leonardo writes, "If a man could be made light as a bird, he would be able to ascend with the aid of a gentle wind." He does not merely sketch. He annotates with the curiosity of an engineer, measurements, calculations of lift, and a note that reads, "The sun's heat will melt the wax, but if we replace wax with a lighter, more resilient material, the flight may endure." In these margins, the myth of Icarus is not a moral lesson but a technical problem to be solved, a challenge to transform mythic aspiration into mechanical possibility. Leonardo's ambition was not abstract. He built a small model of a glider, tested it on the hilltops of Milan, and recorded the results in his notebooks. He wrote, "The bird's wing is a marvel of nature. Its curvature and the tension of its feathers create a perfect balance of lift and drag." Here we see a direct dialogue with the myth. The bird's wing becomes a metaphor for human ingenuity, and the wax of Icarus's wings is replaced by a material science problem. Leonardo's work, though never culminating in a successful human flight, laid the groundwork for the centuries of aeronautical experimentation that would follow. In this sense, Icarus's fall becomes less a warning than a prompt to improve the very wax that melted. Parallel to Leonardo's technical pursuits, the visual arts of the same period offered a different, more critical perspective. Pieter Bruegel the Elder's Landscape with the Fall of Icarus, painted around 1560, places the tragic figure almost as an afterthought. In the foreground, a farmer plows his field, a shepherd tends his flock, a ship sails calmly on the distant sea. The sun hangs low, a golden disk, and somewhere in the water's reflection, a pair of wings melt and sink. Icarus is barely visible, a splash of white in the water, a faint glint of broken feathers. Bruegel's composition asks a stark question: what does the world think of the individual who reaches too high? The painting suggests that society, engrossed in its own labor, remains indifferent to the soaring ambitions and the subsequent downfall of the dreamer. It is a visual critique of the very indifference that would later be invoked by revolutionary pamphleteers who saw in Icarus a symbol of the oppressed masses daring to rise against a rigid hierarchy. The transformation from moral caution to emblem of daring is perhaps most dramatically illustrated by the 1609 publication of Johannes Kepler's Somnium, often called the first work of science fiction. Kepler, an astronomer whose laws of planetary motion reshaped humanity's understanding of the cosmos, wrote a fictional tale of a young boy named Duracatus who travels to the moon, guided by a demon who equips him with a special set of wings. Kepler's narrative is framed as a dream, a somnium, a sleep vision. Yet within its pages he embeds rigorous astronomical observations, calculations of lunar gravity, and the challenges of a voyage through the void. In the opening of the work, Kepler writes, "The desire to ascend beyond the earthly sphere is as old as the myth of Icarus, yet we must temper it with the knowledge of the heavens." Here, the myth is reclaimed not as a warning but as an inspiration, a literary device that allows Kepler to explore the limits of human knowledge while acknowledging the perils of ungrounded ambition. The fictional flight to the moon becomes a metaphor for scientific progress, a daring ascent that must be guided by careful measurement lest the wings, now made of mathematics and observation, fail. 2 decades later, the myth would be seized by a very different kind of flight, political flight. In 1798, amid the fervor of the French Revolution, pamphleteers and propagandists circulated broadsheets that featured Icarus soaring above the Bastille, his waxen wings replaced by the tricolor flag, his descent hinted at by a storm cloud of aristocratic heads. One such pamphlet, titled L'Icarien de la Liberté, declared, "We are the Icarus of the people, daring to rise above the tyrant's sun, and we shall not be melted by the old order." The image was deliberately provocative. It suggested that the revolutionary cause was a noble ascent, a collective Icarus daring to break free from oppressive structures. Yet the same pamphlet warned, if we forget the lessons of Daedalus, if we ignore the fragility of our wings, we shall fall into the abyss of chaos. In this duality, the myth was both a rallying cry and a caution, reflecting the revolutionary paradox of hope and terror. The use of Icarus in revolutionary imagery demonstrates how the myth had become a flexible symbol, capable of being molded to the aspirations of scientific, artistic, and political movements alike. The Enlightenment, that age of reason, further reinterpreted Icarus through the lenses of satire, aesthetics, and the sublime. Voltaire, ever the sharp wit, inserted a brief but pointed reference to Icarus in his satirical novella, Candide. When Candide and his companions encounter a group of philosophers debating the nature of progress, Voltaire writes, "They argued that the world is a laboratory, that we must test the limits of our wings, even if it means we might melt like Icarus for the sake of a better tomorrow. The irony is palpable." Voltaire mocks the optimism of his contemporaries, suggesting that unchecked optimism can lead to reckless experiments, much like Icarus's ill-fated flight. Yet even in his satire, Voltaire acknowledges the allure of the ascent, the desire to test the boundaries of human capability. Immanuel Kant, in his Critique of Judgment, offers a more profound philosophical framing of the Icarian ascent. Kant discusses the concept of the sublime, that feeling of awe that arises when we confront something vast and beyond our comprehension, yet which also elevates the mind. He writes, "The mind, when faced with the infinite, experiences a sublime pleasure, for it recognizes its own capacity to think beyond the limits of sense." He then cites the myth of Icarus as a perfect illustration. The flight of Icarus, though doomed, reveals the human yearning for the infinite, the desire to rise above the earthly, to glimpse the sublime. For Kant, the tragedy does not diminish the value of the ascent. Rather, it underscores the tension between our finite nature and our infinite aspirations. The wings that melt become a symbol of the limits of our physical being, while the very act of soaring reflects the boundless reach of our rational mind. Yet not all Enlightenment thinkers celebrated the Icarian ambition without reservation. Jean-Jacques Rousseau offered a stark counterpoint, emphasizing the corruption that can arise from the relentless pursuit of knowledge. In his Discourse on the Arts and Sciences, Rousseau argues that civilization's progress has led to moral decay, that the more we perfect our inventions, the more we distance ourselves from the natural virtue that resides within us. He later draws on the myth, writing, "Consider Icarus, who, in his desire to rise above the earth, abandoned the wisdom of his father and fell. So too does man, when he seeks knowledge for its own sake, lose his innate goodness." Rousseau's critique frames Icarus not as a daring pioneer, but as a cautionary figure whose ambition blinds him to the virtues of humility and natural simplicity. In this view, the ascent is a moral misstep, a loss of the innate purity that Rousseau believes is the foundation of true happiness. Edmund Burke, writing in the aftermath of the French Revolution, offers a conservative perspective that echoes Rousseau's caution, but grounds it in a different tradition. In his reflections on the revolution in France, Burke warns that the desire for rapid change, for the breaking of all old bonds, is as dangerous as a man who fashions wings of wax and dares to fly too close to the sun. He sees the Icarian myth as a warning that progress must be tempered by tradition, that the accumulated wisdom of centuries serves as a stabilizing force against the hubris of unchecked innovation. Burke's argument is not a denial of progress, but a call for measured incremental change, a measured ascent rather than a reckless plunge. He writes, "The great edifices of society are built upon the foundations of the past. To tear them down in a single, daring leap is to invite disaster." These counterarguments do not diminish the power of Icarus as a symbol. Rather, they enrich the dialogue, reminding us that every ascent carries both promise and peril. The tension between the daring of Leonardo's sketches, the critique of Bruegel's canvas, the speculative flight of Kepler's Somnium, and the revolutionary fervor of 1798 all intersect in a complex web of meaning that continues to unfold in contemporary debates. Today, as we confront the limits of genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, and climate intervention, the Icarian metaphor resurfaces with renewed urgency. When a team of bioengineers announces a breakthrough in crysets, genetic editing tools that could eradicate disease, but also acknowledges the risk of unintended ecological consequences, one can almost hear the whisper of Daedalus. Do not forget the fragility of your wings. Similarly, when a private company proposes a commercial spaceflight that would send civilians beyond the atmosphere, the public discourse inevitably recalls the ancient warning. If you fly too close to the sun, the wax will melt. The myth of Daedalus himself remains a crucial counterpart in this conversation. Daedalus, the master craftsman, is the archetype of the inventive mind, the one who designs the wings, who calculates the angles, who warns his son to temper his ambition. In many Renaissance texts, Daedalus is celebrated as a symbol of human ingenuity. In a letter to his patron, the poet Michel de Montaigne writes, "Daedalus, the architect of the labyrinth, teaches us that the mind can create pathways where none exist, yet he also knows that the path must be walked with caution." The relationship between father and son, between creator and creation, mirrors the modern relationship between scientist and technology. The creator's responsibility, the ethical dimension of invention, becomes as central to the discourse as the daring of the ascent itself. Cross-referencing with other myths deepens the analysis. The Prometheus myth, for instance, presents another figure who defies the gods to bring fire to humanity, suffering eternal punishment for his transgression. Both Icarus and Prometheus embody the human drive to acquire knowledge and power beyond natural limits, yet their stories diverge. Prometheus endures while Icarus perishes. This contrast has been used by philosophers to argue that the pursuit of knowledge need not be fatal if accompanied by resilience and sacrifice. In contrast, the myth of Sisyphus, as interpreted by Albert Camus, suggests that the endless striving itself, regardless of outcome, can be a source of meaning. Camus writes, "The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart." In this light, Icarus's fall is not a defeat but a testament to the value of the attempt, an affirmation that the very act of reaching upward is what gives life its vigor. Returning to the Renaissance, Leonardo's Codex Atlanticus contains a marginal note that reads, "The sun's heat is the enemy of wax, yet the heat also gives life to the world." This paradox captures the dual nature of progress. The same force that fuels discovery can also cause destruction. The Renaissance's fascination with the sun, seen in the heliocentric theories of Copernicus, the solar studies of Galileo, mirrored the Icarian tension. The sun, a source of light and knowledge, also represented the perilous heat that could melt the fragile wings of human ambition. The metaphor extends to the Enlightenment celebration of reason as a light that dispels darkness, yet also a fire that can burn those unprepared for its intensity. Voltaire's satire, Kant's sublime, Rousseau's natural virtue, and Burke's tradition each invoke Icarus in a different philosophical register, yet they converge on a shared recognition that the human desire to transcend limits is both the engine of progress and the seed of potential ruin. The Renaissance artist's brush, the Enlightenment philosopher's pen, the scientist's telescope, and the revolutionary's pamphlet all wielded the image of Icarus to articulate hopes and anxieties about the future. The image of Icarus, once a simple caution, became a canvas upon which each era projected its aspirations and fears. Consider the example of the early modern aeronauts, the balloonists of the late 18th century. The Montgolfier brothers, in 1783, launched a hot air balloon that rose gently above the Parisian skyline. Spectators gasped as the balloon ascended, and newspapers heralded the event as the flight of modern Icarus. Yet, the same newspapers warned, "Let us not forget that the sun's heat may one day turn our balloons to ash." The balloonists themselves, aware of the danger, often quoted the myth, saying, "We are like Icarus, but we have learned to fashion wings of cloth and fire, and we pray the sun will be kind." Their daring was a literal embodiment of the Icarian ascent, tempered by the technological knowledge that could prevent the wax from melting. In the 19th century, the image resurfaced in the realm of art through the Romantic movement. Caspar David Friedrich's Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog depicts a solitary figure standing atop a precipice, gazing into an infinite expanse. Though not a direct depiction of Icarus, the painting evokes the same yearning for the sublime, the same tension between the desire to rise and the awareness of the abyss below. Friedrich's work was often interpreted in contemporary essays as a visual representation of the Icarian impulse. The wanderer seeks the heights of understanding, yet must confront the fog of the unknown. The Romantic poets, such as William Wordsworth, wrote of the lofty winged thoughts that soar beyond the earth, echoing the myth's resonance in an age that prized individual feeling and the transcendence of ordinary experience. In the 20th century, Icarus reappeared in the modernist imagination. The poet T.S. Eliot in The Waste Land writes, "I have heard the key turn in the door once and turn again, a little Icarus, trembling in the sun." Eliot's fragmented modernist vision suggests a world in which the old myths are broken, yet their core anxieties persist. The little Icarus is a figure of fragility amidst a chaotic landscape, a reminder that even in an age of technology, the human longing to rise remains fraught with vulnerability. The contemporary scientific arena offers perhaps the most vivid illustration of the Icarian metaphor. In the field of artificial intelligence, researchers speak of superintelligence as a horizon that, if reached, could fundamentally alter humanity's place in the cosmos. Nick Bostrom, a philosopher of technology, writes in Superintelligence, Paths, Dangers, Strategies, "We stand at the foot of a mountain of unknown height. To climb it, we must build tools that may become our own masters." The metaphor of climbing a mountain echoes Daedalus's engineering, while the risk of melting wings is reflected in the possibility that an uncontrolled AI could bring about catastrophic outcomes. Bostrom's cautionary tone mirrors the ancient warning, yet his call to engineer with foresight also suggests that the Icarian ascent can be managed, that we can design wings from materials stronger than wax. In bioethics, the debate over CRISPR gene editing mirrors the same tension. When He Jiankui announced in 2018 that he had edited the genomes of twin girls to confer resistance to HIV, the world reacted with a mixture of awe and horror. The scientific community, recalling the Icarian myth, warned that playing with the fundamental code of life is akin to fashioning wings of wax. We must not let the sun of ambition melt them before we understand the consequences. Yet proponents argue that the potential to eradicate disease is a noble ascent, that the wings can be reinforced through rigorous oversight, peer review, and ethical frameworks. The ongoing dialogue reflects the dual heritage of Icarus as both inspiration and warning. The modern artistic sphere continues to reinterpret Icarus in ways that emphasize freedom. The street artist Banksy, in a 2017 mural on a London wall, painted a young girl with a paper airplane that leaves a trail of bright, glowing feathers, soaring above a cityscape of smog. Beneath the image, a stencil reads, "We are all Icarus, but the sun is not the enemy, ignorance is." Banksy's work reframes the myth. The sun is no longer the destructive force, but the lack of understanding that prevents us from safely navigating our ascent. The mural invites viewers to consider that the danger lies not in ambition itself, but in the failure to acquire the knowledge that can protect our wings. Even in popular culture, the Icarian motif persists. The 2015 film The Theory of Everything, which dramatizes the life of physicist Stephen Hawking, includes a scene where Hawking, despite his physical limitations, imagines himself flying beyond the constraints of his body, echoing the myth of a mind that soars while the flesh remains grounded. The narrative underscores the idea that the ascent can be intellectual rather than physical, that the wings can be ideas, equations, and theories that lift us beyond our immediate limitations. The philosophical discourse on the limits of scientific inquiry often returns to the ancient question, should there be boundaries to what we pursue? The precautionary principle, widely invoked in environmental policy, suggests that when an activity raises threats of harm to human health or the environment, precautionary measures should be taken even if some cause and effect relationships are not fully established. This principle can be read as a modern embodiment of the Daedalian warning. Before we fashion new wings, we must test their resilience against the sun's heat. Yet critics argue that an overly cautious stance stifles innovation, that the fear of falling prevents the flight that could rescue us from our own self-inflicted crises. The debate is alive in discussions about geoengineering, deliberate interventions in Earth's climate system to counteract global warming. Proponents see it as humanity's chance to fly above the climate crisis, while opponents warn that meddling with planetary systems could have unforeseen, catastrophic consequences, another modern Icarus scenario. In education, the myth continues to serve as a pedagogical tool. Teachers ask students to write essays on Icarus as a symbol of scientific progress, encouraging them to explore how the myth can be reframed from a cautionary tale to a celebration of human curiosity. In doing so, students encounter the layered history of the myth, from Leonardo's sketches to Kant's Sublime, from Rousseau's critique to Burke's conservatism, and they develop a nuanced understanding that progress is never a simple linear ascent, but a complex interplay of ambition, ethics, and societal context. The interplay between Icarus and Daedalus also offers a lens through which to examine contemporary interdisciplinary collaborations. In modern engineering projects, think of the International Space Station. Physicists, engineers, biologists, and ethicists work together, each contributing a piece of the wing. The father figure, Daedalus, can be seen as the collective body of knowledge that designs the structure, while the son represents the individual projects that test the limits. When the ISS module Harmony was launched in 2007, engineers reflected on the myth, noting that our wings are built not of wax but of composite materials and rigorous testing, yet we remain mindful of the sun's radiation and the fragility of human life in space. The collaboration itself embodies a balanced approach. Ambition tempered by caution, innovation guided by collective wisdom. Historical anecdotes further illustrate how the myth was wielded as a political symbol. During the French Revolution, beyond the pamphlets of 1798, a lesser-known episode occurred in 1793 when the Committee of Public Safety commissioned a series of engravings for the Calendrier Républicain. One engraving, titled Le Vol d'Icar, depicted Icarus with a Phrygian cap soaring above the guillotine. The caption read, "Liberty ascends, but beware the son of tyranny." The image was displayed in public squares, reminding citizens that while the revolution aimed to lift the people, it must avoid the hubris that could lead to self-destruction. The revolutionary leadership, aware of the myth's dual nature, used it both to inspire and to caution, a delicate balance that mirrors the modern tension between scientific optimism and ethical restraint. Another anecdote from the early 19th century involves the famed poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, who, in his 1820 poem Prometheus Unbound, writes, "Icarus, thou art my brother. We both have dared to fly yet the sun that burns our wings is the same that gives us light." Shelley, a radical thinker who championed liberty and the overthrow of oppressive regimes, saw Icarus as a martyr for the cause of intellectual freedom. He argued that the fall was not a failure but a necessary sacrifice, a way to illuminate the path for those who follow. Shelley's poetic reimagining further cements the myth's capacity to be reshaped according to the aspirations of each generation. In the realm of modern philosophy, the Icarian metaphor resurfaces in discussions of transhumanism, the belief that humanity can and should use technology to transcend its biological limits. Philosopher Nick Bostrom, mentioned earlier, writes, "If we can augment our bodies, enhance our cognition, perhaps even achieve digital immortality, we are in effect crafting new wings." Yet, transhumanist debates are rife with cautionary voices. Critics such as Michael Sandel, in The Case Against Perfection, argue that the pursuit of enhancement risks eroding the very essence of what makes us human. Sandel's argument echoes Rousseau's concern that the pursuit of knowledge can corrupt natural virtue, suggesting that the Icarian ascent may lead to a loss of authentic humanity. The modern legal arena also grapples with the Icarian dilemma. In 2020, the European Court of Justice ruled on the right to be forgotten, a decision that balanced the desire for technological progress in data handling with the protection of individual dignity. The court's majority opinion noted, "We must not allow the digital sun to scorch personal privacy in our haste to innovate." The metaphor of the sun's heat as an unstoppable force that can damage fragile wings finds a new home in the discourse on digital rights, illustrating how the ancient myth continues to inform contemporary ethical considerations. To bring these threads together, let us return to the core image, a boy, wings of feather and wax, soaring toward a bright sun. In the Renaissance, the wings were replaced by sketches of gliders and mechanical birds. The sun was the promise of discovery. In the Enlightenment, the wings became ideas, the sun a symbol of reason and the infinite. In the age of revolutions, the wings were flags, the sun a beacon of liberty. In the age of science, the wings are algorithms, gene sequences, rockets, and the sun is both the literal star we aim to reach and the metaphorical heat of unintended consequences. Each era reimagines the same basic story, layering it with its own hopes, fears, and values. What does this mean for us listening today? It invites us to ask with quiet reflection whether we are more like Icarus, daring to push beyond the known, or more like Daedalus, careful enough to design wings that can endure the heat. It asks us to consider whether our ambition is guided by humility and foresight, or whether we are blinded by the brilliance of the sun. It reminds us that progress is not a straight line upward, but a spiral, rising, falling, learning, rising again. The myth teaches that each ascent must be accompanied by a reckoning with the forces that can melt our wings, whether they be physical heat, ethical oversight, or societal indifference. In the end, the Icarian story is not a simple moral about hubris. It is a living narrative that has been reshaped by artists, scientists, philosophers, and activists across centuries. It is a mirror that reflects the shifting balance between human aspiration and the limits of our creations. As we stand on the cusp of new frontiers, quantum computing, space colonization, synthetic biology, the ancient wings of Icarus flutter anew, reminding us that the desire to reach for the sun is as old as humanity itself. May we honor the myth by crafting wings of stronger material, by learning from the lessons of Leonardo, Bruegel, Kepler, and the revolutionaries, and by listening to the voices of Rousseau and Burke that caution us to temper our ascent with wisdom. In doing so, perhaps we can finally achieve a flight that does not end in a splash, but in a graceful glide toward a horizon that beckons, ever bright, ever distant, yet ever within reach. When we look up at the sky and imagine a young man daring to stretch his wings beyond the reach of ordinary mortals, we are not merely recalling a myth that children hear in school. We are confronting a living symbol that has been reimagined, dissected, and rewoven into the fabric of 20th century thought. In the restless century that gave us existentialism, psychoanalysis, and the first steps on the lunar surface, Icarus became a mirror for the most pressing questions about freedom, anxiety, and the self. In this segment, we will follow that mirror, tracing how philosophers like Sartre and Camus, psychoanalysts such as Freud and Jung, and even engineers and countercultural poets have each taken Icarus's flight and turned it into a laboratory for their own theories. We will also hear the dissenting voices of Heidegger and Foucault, who remind us that the story can be read in ways that pull us back toward the earth rather than upward. Sartre's notion of bad faith offers a first, stark lens through which to view Icarus's decision to climb higher and higher. In Being and Nothingness, Sartre insists that existence precedes essence, that we are first thrown into the world, and only later do we define ourselves through our choices. Freedom, then, is not a luxury but a radical condition of human being, yet this freedom can be terrifying. Sartre writes, "Man is condemned to be free, because once thrown into the world, he is responsible for everything he does." The condemnation lies not in the lack of options, but in the weight of responsibility that each option carries. Bad faith for Sartre is the attempt to flee that responsibility, to hide behind a fixed identity, a social role, or a set of predetermined values. It is the lie we tell ourselves that we are not free, that we are merely a cog in the machine or a servant of fate. Now imagine the young Icarus, perched on the edge of a cliff, feeling the warm sun on his newly fashioned wings. He could have chosen the safe path to glide just above the sea, to obey Daedalus's warning, to stay within the limits set by his father. Instead, he chooses to push the very limits of his own creation. In Sartrean terms, that is an act of authentic freedom. He does not hide behind the role of son or craftsman. He declares, through action, that his existence is defined by his own desire to reach for the sun. The very moment he decides to ascend, he embraces the anxiety that Sartre calls anguish, the feeling that the world is open, and we are the ones who must fill it. Icarus's ascent is a concrete illustration of Sartre's claim that man is a being whose existence is defined by his freedom to choose, but authenticity is never a clean line. Sartre warns that even the most daring choice can slide into bad faith if it becomes a fixed identity. If Icarus were to say, "I am the one who flies higher than any man," and then cling to that label as an unexamined truth, he would have turned his freedom into a new form of self-imposed constraint. The very act that began as a rebellion against limitation could become a new limitation, a self-imposed myth that he could not escape. The tension between the exhilarating possibility of radical freedom and the subtle trap of self-definition is the core of Sartre's existential drama, and Icarus's story captures it in a single, sun-burned moment. Camus, writing a few decades later, would see in Icarus not only the tragedy of a failed rebellion, but also the stubborn, absurd hero who refuses to surrender to meaninglessness. In the myth of Sisyphus, Camus declares, "The absurd man is he who is aware of the limits of his existence and yet continues to revolt. The absurd hero is not a nihilist. He is a rebel who acknowledges that the universe offers no ultimate justification, yet insists on living fully anyway." Icarus's flight, then, is an absurd act. A conscious decision to soar despite the knowledge that the sun will melt his wings, that the sea will claim his body, that the gods have already scripted his fate. He does not fly because he expects a happy ending. He flies because he refuses to be content with the ground. Camus's rebellion is not a call for reckless optimism. He writes, "There is no love of life without despair, and there is no despair without love of life." Icarus's love of the sky, his yearning for the light, is inseparable from the despair of his inevitable fall. Yet the very act of rising becomes a defiant affirmation of life. The sun, in this reading, is not a hostile deity, but a symbol of the ultimate, indifferent reality that we all confront. By flying toward it, Icarus declares, "I will meet the indifferent universe on my own terms." Camus would argue that this is the highest form of authenticity, to recognize the absurd and still to choose to act. The modern existential reading of Icarus does not stop at the philosophical text. It finds resonance in the very concrete moments of 20th century history. The Apollo 11 mission in 1969, for instance, can be read as a collective Icarus flight. When Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface, humanity collectively stretched its wings toward a sun that, in this case, was the bright, unforgiving glare of the moon's surface. The engineers and astronauts were acutely aware of the dangers, the vacuum, the radiation, the thin line of fuel that could have left them stranded forever. Yet they chose to ignore the ancient warning of "do not fly too close to the sun," and instead embraced the absurd freedom of reaching for an unreachable world. As Buzz Aldrin later reflected, we were a little bit like Icarus, but we had a whole lot of engineering to keep us from melting. The mission was a triumph of human daring, yet it also reminded us of the fragility of our creations. The heat of re-entry, the precise calculations required to avoid burning up, these were the modern wax and feathers, the very physics that turned myth into engineering. In the 1970s, a different kind of flight took place, a cultural one. The countercultural movement, with its embrace of psychedelic experiences, high consciousness, and radical questioning of authority, can be seen as a mass Icarian ascent. The phrase "fly higher" became a literal invitation to explore altered states of mind through LSD, psilocybin, and other substances. Figures like Timothy Leary famously declared, "Turn on, tune in, drop out," urging a flight beyond the ordinary limits of perception. This cultural Icarus was not content with the ordinary sky of mainstream values. It sought the luminous, sometimes blinding realm of expanded consciousness. Yet, just as the ancient myth warns, many who took these flights encountered a metaphorical sun that melted their wings through mental breakdowns, social alienation, or tragic deaths. The movement's own literature often referenced Icarus directly, seeing the myth as a cautionary tale about the limits of human cognition and the need for grounding. Turning now to the psychoanalytic dimension, Sigmund Freud offers a different, more intimate reading of the flight. In the interpretation of dreams, Freud writes, "Dreams are the royal road to the unconscious." He also speaks of the Oedipal complex, the unconscious desire of the child to supplant the father and claim the mother's love. The story of Icarus can be interpreted as an Oedipal flight, a symbolic attempt to outshine the father figure, Daedalus, who both creates the wings and imposes the limits. The sun then becomes a phallic symbol of ultimate power and authority. Icarus's ascent is the unconscious child's wish to rise above the paternal authority, to claim the ultimate light that the father guards. When the wax melts, Freud would say, the dream reveals the inevitable return of the child to the reality principle. The unconscious cannot sustain an unchecked wish without the intervention of the ego. The fall, the painful return to the sea, is the punishment that the psyche imposes for the transgression. Freud also notes that in the dream work, condensation and displacement allow multiple meanings to fuse. The wings made of wax are both fragile and luminous. They condense the child's desire for freedom, the wax, and the danger of that freedom, the sun. The sea, a symbol of the maternal womb, receives Icarus back in a tragic, inverted rebirth. The Oedipal reading thus adds a layer of psychic conflict that runs parallel to the existential one. The desire for freedom is not only a philosophical choice, but also an unconscious drive rooted in early familial dynamics. Carl Jung expands the symbolic terrain by introducing the archetype of the Icarian self. Jung writes, "The archetype is a primordial image that recurs in the collective unconscious, a pattern of psychic organization that shapes our perception." For Jung, Icarus embodies the tension between the ego and the shadow, between conscious aspiration and the darker, unintegrated parts of the psyche. The sun represents the self, the totality of the psyche that includes both light and darkness. The wings, crafted from wax, are the ego's attempt to grasp the self without acknowledging the shadow. The melting of the wax is the inevitable exposure of the shadow when the ego overreaches. Jung would argue that the Icarian flight is a necessary rite of passage. The hero must fly high enough to confront the self, must experience the heat that reveals the hidden aspects of the psyche, and must then return, transformed, to the earth. In Jungian therapy, this myth is used to illustrate the process of individuation, the integration of the shadow into the conscious self. A client who feels stuck may be encouraged to fly higher, to explore the parts of themselves that have been suppressed. But the therapist also warns that the ascent must be accompanied by a grounding practice, meditation, ritual, or creative work to prevent the wax from melting entirely. The Icarian self, then, is not a static image but a dynamic process. The flight, the heat, the fall, and the eventual rise again. Both Freud and Jung, despite their differences, agree that the myth is not merely a story about hubris. It is a map of the inner world, The sun can be the father's authority, the collective unconscious, or the ultimate truth that the psyche seeks. The wax is the fragile material of egoic constructions, and the sea is the return to the unconscious, sometimes painful, sometimes restorative. Now let us consider the counterarguments that remind us not to read every assent as a triumph of freedom. Martin Heidegger, in his essay, The Question Concerning Technology, warns that modern humanity has forgotten the question of being by becoming enamored with the notion of standing reserve, of viewing the world as a resource to be exploited. Heidegger would read Icarus's flight as a symptom of forgetfulness of being, a turning away from the groundedness that allows authentic existence. He writes, "The danger is that we shall be able to think about being only as a presence, as an object." In Icarus's case, the sun becomes an object of desire, a technological sublime that promises transcendence, while the earth is reduced to a mere launch pad. The critique suggests that the story is not a celebration of radical freedom, but a caution that when we chase the sun, we lose the sense of dwelling that Heidegger sees as essential. The flight, then, is not an authentic act, but a misreading of our relationship to the world. Mitchell Foucault adds another layer of critique, focusing on power relations. In Discipline and Punish, Foucault argues that power is everywhere. It is not an institution, but a complex strategic situation. The story of Icarus can be seen as a narrative that disciplines bodies through the promise of transcendence. The father's warning, "Do not fly too high," is not merely paternal care, but a form of sovereign power that limits the body's potential. The sun, as a distant authority, serves as a disciplinary apparatus. It promises glory to those who dare approach, while simultaneously threatening destruction. The flight then becomes a site where power inscribes itself on the body, shaping desire, ambition, and fear. Foucault would ask, who benefits when Icarus falls? Who gains from the myth that glorifies the fall? The answer perhaps lies in the maintenance of social order. The story serves as a warning that encourages conformity, that the high is dangerous, and that the ground is the safe, regulated space of the state. Both Heidegger and Foucault thus remind us that the Icarian narrative can be used to legitimize certain power structures, to mask the loss of being, or to enforce disciplinary regimes. Their critiques do not deny the existential or psychoanalytic readings, but they broaden the scope, urging us to consider the socio-political dimensions of the myth. Returning to Camus, we find a useful cross-reference in the myth of Sisyphus, where Camus writes, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy." The absurd hero, like Icarus, is aware of the futility of his task, yet he persists. Sisyphus rolls a stone up a hill only to watch it roll down again. Icarus climbs toward the sun, only to fall. Both are caught in cycles that seem to deny meaning, yet both find a kind of defiant joy in the act itself. Camus's insistence that the struggle itself is enough resonates with the modern view of space exploration as a pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, regardless of the practical benefits. The Apollo 11 flight, for example, was as much an existential statement, a human being stepping onto another world, as it was a technological achievement. In this way, the Icarian myth intersects with the concept of the technological sublime, a term philosophers like David Nye have used to describe the awe inspired by large-scale technological feats. The technological sublime captures the simultaneous feeling of empowerment and terror that arises when humanity confronts forces that dwarf its individual existence. The sun, the rocket, the lunar surface all become modern equivalents of the ancient blaze that melted Icarus's wings. Yet the technological sublime also carries a warning. The same awe that fuels ambition can also blind us to the ecological and ethical costs of our pursuits. The Apollo missions, while glorious, were also products of a Cold War competition that diverted resources from pressing social needs. The countercultural high experiences of the 1970s, while seeking liberation, sometimes ignored the mental health crises that ensued for many participants. The sublime thus becomes a double-edged sword, a source of inspiration and a source of hubris. Let us pause now and consider two concrete examples that illustrate the Icarian tension between freedom and anxiety. First, the story of astronaut Michael Collins, the command module pilot of Apollo 11, who remained in orbit while Armstrong and Aldrin walked on the moon. Collins famously described his experience as the loneliest man in the universe, yet he also wrote about the profound sense of perspective that the Earth offered from above. He felt both the exhilaration of being part of a historic flight and the anxiety of being suspended in the void, a modern Icarus who never left the ship but still confronted the sun's glare from a distance. His reflections echo Sartre's notion that freedom is the source of anxiety, because the very act of being part of a historic venture made him acutely aware of his own contingency. Second, consider the life of the poet Allen Ginsberg, a central figure of the 1960s counterculture. Ginsberg's poem Howl opens with the line, "I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked." He writes of the sun as a metaphor for the intoxicating allure of artistic and sexual freedom, but also as a force that can burn. Ginsberg's own experiments with psychedelics and his public readings were acts of soaring beyond conventional language, a poetic Icarus who sought to touch the ineffable. Yet his later years, marked by health struggles and disillusionment with the outcomes of the 1960s, reflect the inevitable descent. Ginsberg's life illustrates Jung's archetype. The ascent, the encounter with the self, and the need to return and integrate the shadow of disillusionment. Analogies help us to feel the texture of the Icarian experience. Imagine a child learning to ride a bicycle. The first push off the ground is a moment of pure freedom, the wind in the face, the sensation of moving without support. The child must balance, feeling the precariousness of the ride, aware that a miscalculation will lead to a fall. The bicycle is the wax-winged invention, the road the sun's heat, the fall into the grass, the sea. The child's exhilaration mirrors Icarus's ascent, the inevitable tumble mirrors the melting of the wax. The lesson, however, is not that the child should never ride, but that each ride teaches the child how to adjust the balance, how to trust the brakes, how to understand the limits of speed. In the same way, existential freedom is not a call to reckless abandon, but a call to continual self-examination and adjustment. A second analogy comes from the world of music. Consider a violinist who pushes the bow to its limits to extract a soaring, high-pitched note. The instrument can produce a beautiful, transcendent sound, but if the player draws the bow too hard, the string may snap, producing a jarring break. The violinist's desire to reach the highest register is akin to Icarus's yearning for the sun. The string's tension represents the fragile wax, the snapping of the string is the fall. Yet the musician learns to modulate pressure, to find the sweet spot where the note sings without breaking. This practice of playing at the edge reflects the existential balance between daring and prudence, between the pursuit of authenticity and the awareness of one's limits. Historical anecdotes further deepen our understanding. The first anecdote, Beyond Apollo, is the story of the 1930s German airship LZ-129 Hindenburg. The Hindenburg was a marvel of technology, a floating city that seemed to embody humanity's ability to rise above the earth. Yet on May 6, 1937, it burst into flame while attempting to dock, its hydrogen-filled envelope igniting in a spectacular disaster. The Hindenburg's tragedy is often read as a modern Icarus story, a massive, wax-like construct, powered by the promise of flight, succumbing to the sun-like heat of a spark. The disaster prompted a cultural reckoning about the limits of technological ambition, echoing Heidegger's warning that the standing reserve of technology can turn the world into a site of danger. The second anecdote concerns the 1960s Summer of Love in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district. Young people gathered in a neighborhood that became a crucible for experiments in love, communal living, and psychedelic exploration. The movement's motto, "Make Love, Not War," was a declaration of an alternative flight, a collective ascent toward a higher consciousness. Yet by the end of the decade, the scene had largely collapsed under the weight of commercial co-optation, police crackdowns, and the personal toll on many participants. The rise and fall of Haight-Ashbury mirrors Icarus's trajectory, an initial soaring toward a luminous ideal, followed by a disillusioned return to the ground. The anecdote illustrates Foucault's point that the promise of transcendence can be harnessed by power structures to discipline bodies, in this case, through drug enforcement policies that sought to contain the high experience. We have now explored the major strands of modern interpretation, but let us circle back to the central philosophical question. What does Icarus teach us about freedom, anxiety, and the self? Sartre tells us that freedom is inescapable and that the anxiety it generates is a sign of authenticity. Camus reminds us that the absurd condition does not demand resignation, but rebellion, a rebellion that can be expressed through any act of daring, even if it leads to a fall. Freud and Jung add the depth of the unconscious, showing that the flight is also a manifestation of inner conflicts, of the desire to integrate shadow and ego. Heidegger and Foucault caution us that the story can be co-opted to reinforce forgetfulness of being or to discipline bodies through the allure of transcendence. When we consider the technological sublime, we see that modern society has built its own wax wings, rockets, skyscrapers, virtual realities, each promising to lift us higher. The sun in this context is not only literal light but also the glare of data, the heat of surveillance, the brilliance of algorithmic prediction. The more we ascend, the more we risk melting under the pressure of expectations, under the ethical weight of our creations. The Icarian metaphor thus becomes a diagnostic tool. It asks us to ask, what are we willing to risk for the sake of reaching higher? And what safeguards do we have to prevent our wings from melting? In practical terms, the Icarian lesson can inform contemporary debates about artificial intelligence. Some technologists speak of superintelligence as a sun we must approach, believing that the benefits outweigh the risks. Others, echoing Heidegger's caution, warn that the pursuit of a god like AI may lead us to forget the essential question of what it means to be human, the being that grounds us. Foucault would add that the discourse surrounding AI often serves to discipline the workforce, promising a future of efficiency while subtly shaping how we think about labor, privacy, and autonomy. The Icarus myth, then, is a narrative framework that helps us navigate these anxieties, reminding us that every ascent must be accompanied by an ethical grounding. To bring the discussion back to the personal sphere, consider how each of us experiences a daily Icarian tension. When we decide to change careers, to speak truth to power, to pursue a creative project that feels too daring, we are choosing to fly higher. The sun may be a boss's disapproval, a fear of failure, or the weight of societal expectations. The wax that holds our wings can be confidence, skill, or the support of loved ones. The moment we feel the heat, the anxiety that creeps in as the stakes rise, we are precisely at the point Sartre described as the anguish of freedom. If we heed Camus, we may choose to embrace that anxiety, to continue the climb, knowing that the very act of rebellion gives our lives meaning. If we listen to Jung, we may seek to integrate the shadow that appears when the sun's heat reveals hidden fears, thus turning a potential fall into an opportunity for growth. In conclusion, the modern existential and psychoanalytic perspectives on Icarus do not offer a single, tidy moral. Instead, they present a constellation of insights that together illuminate the complexity of human freedom. The myth invites us to ask, how far can we go? And what do we do when we realize the sun is hotter than we imagined? Sartre's bad faith warns us against hiding behind excuses. Camus's absurd hero urges us to keep climbing. Freud's Oedipal analysis reminds us that the flight is rooted in deep, often unacknowledged desires. Jung's archetype shows us that the ascent is a necessary encounter with the self. Heidegger and Foucault, meanwhile, keep us honest about the dangers of forgetting the ground and of allowing power to masquerade as transcendence. By weaving together these strands, the philosophical, the psychoanalytic, the historical, the technological, and the personal, we honor the richness of the Icarus myth as a living laboratory for the questions that still haunt us today. The next time we see a plane cutting a bright line across a blue sky, or a satellite glinting in the sun's glare, or even a poet daring to write a line that shatters convention, we might pause and ask ourselves, are we like Icarus soaring toward a brighter horizon, or are we simply chasing a heat that will melt our wings? And perhaps, with the wisdom of the thinkers we have explored, we can find a way to adjust the wax, to temper the sun, and to land safely back on the earth, richer for the flight we dared to take. When we look up at the sky, the story of Icarus is the one that first comes to mind. A boy who dared to rise higher than the sun, only to be undone by his own overambition. That ancient Greek myth, recorded by Ovid in his Metamorphoses, he rose aloft, and his waxen wings melted in the heat of the sun, has become a shorthand for hubris, for the peril that follows when humanity reaches beyond its limits. Yet the myth does not belong solely to antiquity. It lives on in every headline about artificial intelligence, every policy debate on climate change, every laboratory that tinkers with the code of life. In this segment, we will trace how the Icarian metaphor has been repurposed for contemporary ethics, technology, and environmental thought, weaving together concrete examples, historical anecdotes, philosophical reflections, and literary echoes. We will ask, what does it mean to fly today, and how can we keep the sun from melting our wings? Let us begin with the origins of the Icarus image in philosophical discourse. The ancient Greeks already used the myth as a cautionary tale about the balance between human aspiration and natural law. In Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound, the Titan who stole fire from the gods is contrasted with his son Icarus. The sun will scorch the wings of those who dare to touch it. This juxtaposition establishes a dual theme, one of creative daring, the other of destructive overreach, that has resonated through the ages. In the Enlightenment, philosophers such as Immanuel Kant spoke of the unsociable use of reason, warning that the pursuit of knowledge without moral restraint could lead to catastrophe. Kant never mentioned Icarus by name, but his admonition that the misuse of reason is a dangerous thing echoes the same warning that the wax of Icarus's wings was not merely a material flaw, but a symbol of untempered ambition. Fast forward to the 20th century, where the Icarus metaphor resurfaced in the context of scientific progress. In his 1945 essay, The Myth of Icarus, the British scientist J.B.S. Haldane wrote, "We have learned to fly, but we have not yet learned to land." Haldane's words capture a tension that would become central to contemporary bioethical debates. The capacity to achieve unprecedented feats paired with a lack of corresponding wisdom. This tension is precisely why modern thinkers, Nick Bostrom, Donna Haraway, Timothy Morton, revisit Icarus when they discuss existential risk, post-human embodiment, and the sprawling presence of climate change as a hyper-object. Nick Bostrom, the philosopher behind the concept of superintelligence, often frames the rise of artificial intelligence as an Icarian flight. In his 2014 paper Superintelligence, Paths, Dangers, Strategies, he warns, if we create an intelligence that surpasses our own, we risk losing control, just as Icarus lost control of his flight. Bostrom's argument is not merely a literary flourish. It is a structural analysis of how a powerful technology can outstrip human governance. He identifies three core risks: the value alignment problem, the control problem, and the speed of takeoff. Each of these risks mirrors a different part of the Icarus story: misaligned values as the wax that cannot withstand the sun, loss of control as the sudden gust that tears the wings, and rapid ascent as the reckless climb toward the heavens. Donna Haraway, in her seminal Cyborg Manifesto, embraces the Icarian metaphor, but reframes it through the lens of feminist theory and technoscience. She writes, the cyborg is a creature in a post-human world, a hybrid of organism and machine who can fly beyond the limits of the flesh, yet must beware the scorching glare of the sun of capitalist exploitation. Haraway's cyborg is an Icarus who is also Prometheus, a being that both steals fire and learns to navigate the sky without melting. She argues that the metaphor of flight can be reclaimed as a site of resistance, provided that the social structures that dictate whose wings are waxed and whose are steel are examined and re-engineered. Timothy Morton in Hyperobjects, Philosophy and Ecology After the End of the World introduces the idea that climate change is a hyper-object, vast, distributed, and beyond ordinary perception. He likens the human response to climate change to Icarus's flight. We are soaring into the sun, not knowing that the heat we feel is not a distant star, but the very atmosphere we are heating. Morton's poetic phrasing reminds us that the sun is not a distant deity, but a planetary system that we have set aflame through our own emissions. In this reading, the myth becomes a diagnostic tool for understanding why societies continue to climb higher, even as the air grows thinner and more toxic. With these philosophical foundations in place, let us turn to two concrete, contemporary examples where the Icarian metaphor is not just illustrative, but literal in the language of policy and public debate. The first is the emergence of autonomous weapon systems, colloquially dubbed Icarus drones, in 2024. These unmanned aerial vehicles are equipped with advanced machine learning algorithms that allow them to identify, track, and engage targets without human intervention. Proponents argue that such drones can reduce civilian casualties by making split-second decisions that are more precise than human pilots. Critics, however, invoke the Icarus story to warn that we are handing the sun's fire, lethal decision-making, to a creation whose wings are built on fragile code. In a 2024 briefing before the United Nations Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, Dr. Elena Marquez, a leading AI ethicist, quoted Ovid directly, "The waxen wings melted in the heat of the sun. So too may our autonomous weapons melt under the heat of unintended consequences." She warned that a single software glitch could cause a cascade of lethal errors, much as a gust of wind sent Icarus spiraling down. The ethical controversy surrounding these drones revolves around three interlocking concerns. First, accountability. If an autonomous drone mistakenly attacks a civilian convoy, who bears responsibility? The programmer, the manufacturer, the military commander, or the machine itself? Second, the erosion of the moral threshold for killing. As the act becomes mediated by algorithms, the psychological barrier that historically prevented indiscriminate violence may weaken. Third, the strategic destabilization of international security. Nations that develop Icarus drones may feel compelled to preemptively strike, creating a spiral of escalation reminiscent of the security dilemma that has driven many arms races throughout history. The Icarian metaphor here serves as a caution that the very technology designed to make war safer could instead make it more frequent and more reckless, because the sun, here, the strategic advantage, appears ever more attainable. The second example is the burgeoning field of CRISPR gene editing, particularly the projects aiming to fly beyond natural limits by editing the human germline to enhance traits such as disease resistance, cognitive capacity, or even longevity. In 2023, a consortium of biotech firms announced a pilot study to edit embryos for a version of the APOE4 allele that could dramatically reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease. The press release framed the endeavor as humanity's next great ascent, but critics responded with an Icarian warning. The very act of rewriting the genetic code of future generations is akin to adding extra feathers to Icarus's wings without considering whether the sun will burn them. Bioethicist Dr. Samuel Ortega, speaking at the World Economic Forum in Davos, invoked the myth to argue for a moratorium on germline editing. We have learned from history that each time we have tried to improve the human condition without humility, we have paid a price. The myth of Icarus reminds us that the sun we chase is not a distant promise of perfection, but a burning reality that can scorch us if we are not prepared. He further cited the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, where nations pledged to limit global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees C, a commitment he described as a collective promise not to fly too close to the Icarian heat. Ortega's appeal illustrates how the Icarus metaphor has become a shared cultural reference point for discussions about the limits of scientific ambition. Both the Icarus drones and CRISPR projects illustrate a common pattern, a technological leap that promises profound benefits, accompanied by an underappreciated risk of catastrophic failure. The pattern mirrors the historical anecdote of the 2008 financial crisis, often described as a collective Icarian overreach. In the years leading up to 2008, financial institutions created complex derivatives, mortgage-backed securities, collateralized debt obligations, and credit default swaps that allowed them to fly higher on the leverages of debt. The metaphor of Icarus was invoked in contemporary commentary. Journalist Michael Lewis wrote, "The banks were building wings of paper, and they were flying too close to the sun of unchecked optimism. When the housing bubble burst, the wax of these financial instruments melted, sending the global economy into a free fall." The crisis serves as a cautionary tale that resonates with the modern debates on AI and gene editing. When the structures that hold the wings together, regulation, ethical oversight, public accountability, are insufficient, the ascent ends in disaster. Another historical moment that carries an Icarian imprint is the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. Negotiators gathered in the French capital with the explicit goal of preventing the Icarian heat of runaway climate change, a phrase that appeared in the final communiqué. "We must act now to keep the planet from heating beyond the point where life can thrive, lest we all become Icarus, falling from the sky we once called home." The agreement's ambition to limit warming to 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels can be read as a collective promise to keep the wings of humanity's industrial flight within a safe envelope. Yet as the years have passed, the world's emissions have continued to climb, and many observers argue that the wax, the political will and technological capacity, has thinned. The Paris Accord thus becomes a living example of how societies can consciously invoke Icarus to set boundaries, but also how those boundaries can be eroded when collective attention wanes. Let us now examine the counterarguments that challenge the dominant Icarian caution. The first comes from transhumanist optimism, a movement that celebrates the very ambition that the myth warns against. Transhumanists such as Max Moore and Natasha Vita-Mora argue that human enhancement, through AI, nanotechnology, and genetic engineering, is not a hubristic flight but an inevitable evolution. In a 2022 essay titled The Icarus Imperative, transhumanist scholar Anders Sandberg writes, "If we are to remain relevant in a universe that is accelerating beyond our comprehension, we must become the Icarus who reaches the sun, not the Icarus who fears it." For transhumanists, the melting of wax is not a failure but a necessary transformation. The sun's heat is the catalyst that forges a new, resilient material, post-human consciousness. They contend that the myth has been misread, that Icarus's tragedy lies not in his ambition, but in his lack of preparation. In their view, the proper response is not to tether our wings, but to engineer better wings, stronger alloys, smarter algorithms, ethical frameworks that evolve alongside the technology. The second counterargument emerges from deep ecology, a philosophical stance that emphasizes the intrinsic value of all living beings and the interdependence of ecosystems. Deep ecologists invoke indigenous narratives of humility and balance, such as the Haudenosaunee principle of the Great Law of Peace, which teaches that humans are stewards, not masters, of the earth. In a 2021 paper, ecologist Joanna Macy writes, "When we speak of flying, we must remember that the sky is not an empty void but a shared atmosphere that sustains all life. To ascend without regard for the ground is to betray the very web of being." From this perspective, the Icarian metaphor warns not just against technological overreach, but against any worldview that places humanity at the center of the cosmos. Deep ecologists argue that the sun is not an external threat, but a manifestation of planetary limits, heat, scarcity, loss of biodiversity, that will inevitably scorch any wing built without regard for the whole. Their warning resonates with indigenous stories of the Great Flood, where a community's arrogance leads to a deluge that resets the balance. These two counterarguments, transhumanist optimism and deep ecological humility, are not merely opposing positions. They are in dialogue with each other, each invoking the myth of Icarus to support divergent visions of the future. The transhumanist reading aligns Icarus with Prometheus, the titan who stole fire to benefit humanity. In fact, many scholars draw a direct line between the two myths. Prometheus's gift of fire is the spark that enables Icarus to build wings, while Icarus's flight demonstrates the daring that follows the acquisition of that fire. Yet the Prometheus narrative also includes a punishment, being bound to a rock while an eagle devours his liver daily, suggesting that the acquisition of power carries an eternal cost. This duality is reflected in contemporary literature, such as Margaret Atwood's The Year of the Flood, where the author creates a dystopian world in which genetic engineering and climate manipulation have led to a flood of hubris. Atwood writes, "We built our towers of silicon and DNA, and the sky fell back on us like the weight of our own ambition." The novel's protagonists, living in the aftermath of ecological collapse, embody a new Icarus who has already fallen, and their struggle is to learn humility before the next ascent. To deepen our understanding, let us consider analogies that illuminate the Icarian dynamic in everyday life. Imagine a child learning to ride a bicycle. The child is given training wheels. Those are the regulatory safeguards that keep the wheels from wobbling off the road. As confidence grows, the training wheels are removed and the child rides free. If the child rides too fast down a steep hill without brakes, the wheels may skid, the child may lose balance, and a crash follows. In the Icarian analogy, the training wheels are the ethical guidelines, legal frameworks, and societal norms that keep our technological flight stable. Removing them prematurely, whether in the rush to deploy autonomous drones or to edit human embryos, creates a scenario where the rider is exposed to the sun of unanticipated consequences. The lesson is not to ban the bicycle, but to ensure that the brakes are functional and the rider is educated about the terrain. Another analogy comes from the world of finance, which we have already touched upon with the 2008 crisis. Think of a skyscraper built on a foundation of sand rather than rock. The architects may design an elegant facade, install state-of-the-art elevators, and add a gleaming spire that points toward the heavens. Yet if the ground beneath is unstable, the building will sway, crack, and eventually collapse under its own weight. The sand represents the fragile assumptions, over-optimistic risk models, unchecked leverage, short-term profit motives that underlie many high-risk technologies. The Icarian warning in this context is a reminder to engineers, policymakers, and investors alike to test the foundation before adding higher stories. Having examined the concrete cases, historical anecdotes, philosophical perspectives, and analogies, we now turn to the practical implications for policy and personal responsibility. In the realm of AI and autonomous weapons, several nations have begun to draft kill-switch protocols that require a human operator to retain final authority over lethal decisions. The European Union's recent AI Act includes provisions for high-risk AI systems, mandating transparency, traceability, and the ability to intervene. These measures can be seen as attempts to reinforce the wax of our wings, adding redundancy, oversight, and accountability to prevent the melt. However, critics argue that such regulations are often too vague or too slow to keep pace with rapid technological development. The challenge, then, is to design governance structures that are as adaptable as the technology they aim to regulate, much like a bird that can adjust its flight path in response to sudden gusts. In the field of gene editing, the International Commission on the Clinical Use of Human Germline Genome Editing, convened by the World Health Organization, has proposed a framework that emphasizes responsible innovation. The framework calls for a global registry of all germline editing trials, a moratorium on enhancements that are not medically necessary, and a robust public dialogue. These recommendations echo the Paris Agreement's emphasis on collective action. By creating a shared set of standards, the international community seeks to prevent any single nation or corporation from flying too close to the sun on its own. Yet, as with climate policy, the enforcement mechanisms remain weak, and the temptation to gain a competitive edge can lead to clandestine projects that bypass oversight. The Icarian metaphor thus serves as both a warning and a rallying cry for transparency and cooperation. From an environmental standpoint, Timothy Morton's concept of hyper-objects pushes us to think of climate change not as a distant future problem, but as a present, pervasive condition that shapes every decision we make. He writes, "We cannot simply step back from the sun. We are already bathed in its heat." This perspective demands that we integrate the Icarian lesson into everyday choices. Reducing carbon footprints, supporting renewable energy, and demanding corporate accountability. It also suggests that the flight we must undertake is not a solitary ascent, but a collective, coordinated glide that respects the atmospheric limits of our planet. In this view, the wings we craft must be made of sustainable materials, solar panels, bio-based composites, ethical AI, so that the very act of flying contributes to cooling rather than heating the atmosphere. Let us now revisit the myth itself, paying close attention to the language of the original source. In Ovid's Metamorphoses, Book 8, the poet writes, "He rose aloft, and his waxen wings melted in the heat of the sun. His body fell into the sea, and the sea took him." The sea in this line is both a place of death and a symbol of the unconscious, the deep that can absorb the hubris of the sky-bound. Contemporary thinkers have reinterpreted the sea as the digital ocean of data that now surrounds us. When autonomous drones crash, their debris often ends up in the ocean, contaminating marine ecosystems. When CRISPR edits are released into the environment, they may spread through microbial communities, altering the genetic sea of life. The myth's ending, therefore, can be read as a caution that any overreach will eventually return to the common ground, be it water, earth, or the shared biosphere, impacting all. The myth also contains a subtle but powerful element of agency. Daedalus, Icarus's father, warned him, "Do not go too high nor too low." This advice is a call for balance, a middle path that avoids both the complacent stagnation of staying close to the earth and the reckless ambition of soaring into the sun. In contemporary ethics, this balance can be framed as the Goldilocks zone of technology, where innovation is neither too timid nor too reckless. It invites us to ask, what does the just right level of ambition look like for AI, for gene editing, for climate action? The answer may differ across domains, but the underlying principle remains. We must calibrate our aspirations with an honest assessment of risk. Cross-referencing with the myth of Prometheus deepens this analysis. Prometheus's gift of fire enabled humanity to cook food, forge metal, and illuminate the night, but it also introduced the capacity for war and destruction. In the same way, the fire of AI and CRISPR can illuminate new possibilities for health and knowledge, while simultaneously casting shadows of surveillance, inequality, and ecological disruption. Scholars such as Karen Barad, in her work on agential realism, argue that fire and wings are co-constituted in the material discursive practices that shape our world. In other words, the technologies we create, the fire, and the aspirations we hold, the wings, are inseparable. They co-evolve within the same socio-technical fabric. This perspective encourages us to view the Icarian metaphor not as a simple cautionary tale, but as a dynamic framework for understanding how ambition and materiality intertwine. Literature continues to echo this dynamic. Margaret Atwood's The Year of the Flood portrays a world where bio-engineered corporations have created designer species that escape human control, leading to ecological collapse. The novel's protagonist, Wren, reflects on humanity's hubris. "We thought we could stitch together a new Eden, but the sun we tried to harness burned us all." Atwood's narrative, though fictional, mirrors real-world anxieties about the unintended consequences of gene drives and synthetic biology. The Icarian motif appears in the novel's recurring symbol of a moth attracted to a street lamp, a creature drawn to light despite the danger. This image reinforces the paradox that the very attraction that drives progress also contains the seed of peril. In the realm of technology policy, the Icarus metaphor has been explicitly invoked in legislative debates. In a 2024 hearing before the U.S. Senate Committee on Armed Services, Senator Elizabeth Warren opened her remarks by stating, "We stand at the edge of a new horizon, where autonomous drones promise precision, but also threaten to turn the skies into a battlefield of unchecked ambition. Let us not become Icarus, blinded by the glow of innovation." Her speech, echoed by several European parliamentarians, demonstrates how the myth has become a shared rhetorical tool that transcends cultural and national boundaries, uniting diverse stakeholders around a common moral concern. Yet, as we have seen, some voices argue that the myth should not be used to stifle progress. In a 2023 keynote at the World Economic Forum, transhumanist futurist Ray Kurzweil declared, "The Icarus story is a myth of fear, not of possibility." Our destiny is to merge with the sun, through nanotech, through AI, through quantum computing. The wax will not melt if we redesign it at the molecular level. Kurzweil's confidence reflects a belief in the transformative power of technology to rewrite the very physics that once limited human flight. He points to advances in metamaterials, engineered substances that can change shape in response to temperature, as evidence that we can create heat-resistant wings. While this optimism is inspiring, it also raises the question: does the creation of ever more resilient wings eliminate the need for humility, or does it simply raise the altitude from which we might fall? Deep ecology offers a counterpoint that reframes the conversation from a human-centric to a planetary-centric perspective. Indigenous scholar Robin Wall-Kimmerer writes, "The Earth does not belong to us, we belong to the Earth." In this view, the sun's heat is not a challenge to be conquered, but a natural limit that signals the health of the whole system. The Icarian metaphor, then, becomes a reminder that any flight that disregards the interconnectedness of life will inevitably destabilize the very environment that makes flight possible. This perspective aligns with the concept of planetary boundaries, a scientific framework that identifies 9 critical thresholds, such as climate change, biodiversity loss, and nitrogen cycles, that humanity must stay within to avoid irreversible damage. The Icarian heat in the Paris Agreement can be interpreted as a collective pledge to stay within the climate boundary, while the wax represents the political and technological safeguards needed to respect all other boundaries. In practice, integrating these insights requires a multi-layered approach. First, at the level of research and development, institutions should adopt ethics by design methodologies, embedding risk assessments and stakeholder consultations into the early stages of technology creation. For autonomous drones, this could mean developing algorithms that not only optimize target identification, but also incorporate ethical constraints, such as proportionality and distinction, as core parameters. For CRISPR, it could involve establishing transparent, publicly funded registries of all germline editing trials, coupled with independent review boards that include ethicists, indigenous representatives, and climate scientists. Second, at the policy level, governments must coordinate internationally to create binding agreements that prevent a race to the sun. The proposed Global AI Governance Treaty, currently under negotiation at the United Nations, aims to set universal standards for autonomous weapons and high-risk AI, mirroring the structure of the Paris Agreement for climate. Third, at the societal level, public education must cultivate a culture that values both ambition and humility. Educational curricula that include myth analysis, using Icarus, Prometheus, and other archetypes, can help students recognize the patterns of hubris and responsibility that recur across history. Finally, we return to the myth's final image, Icarus falling into the sea, his body reclaimed by the waters. In contemporary terms, this image can be read as an invitation to consider the possibility of redemption after failure. The sea does not merely end the story, it also holds the potential for regeneration. In the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, reforms such as the Dodd-Frank Act and the creation of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau emerged as attempts to reinforce the wax of financial regulation. After the 2024 controversy over autonomous drones, several nations have instituted moratoriums and established joint oversight committees, signaling a willingness to learn from near misses. In the field of gene editing, the International Summit on Human Genome Editing in 2025 resulted in a consensus statement that emphasized precaution, transparency, and the inclusion of diverse voices, a collective effort to thicken the wax before the next ascent. The Icarus metaphor, therefore, remains a living tool for navigating the complex terrain of contemporary ethics, technology, and environmental thought. It reminds us that ambition is not inherently immoral. It becomes dangerous when divorced from foresight, accountability, and an appreciation for the interdependence of all life. As we stand at the crossroads of AI, climate change, and bioengineering, we can choose to be Icarus who learns to temper his ascent with wisdom, or we can choose to be Icarus who, blinded by the brilliance of his own invention, forgets the fragile nature of his wings. The choice, as always, lies not in the myth itself, but in how we interpret and act upon its lessons. So, as you reflect on the stories of autonomous drones soaring above battlefields, on the promise of CRISPR editing the very code of our being, on the negotiations that strive to keep the planet from overheating, ask yourself, what wax are we using to bind our wings? Is it robust enough to endure the sun's heat, or is it a fragile veneer that will melt under pressure? And perhaps more importantly, who decides the shape of that wax, scientists, policymakers, corporations, or the global citizenry? The ancient warning of Icarus invites us to answer these questions with humility, with curiosity, and with a commitment to keep our flight within the bounds of what sustains us all.